So I'm going to talk a little bit about this new book. This is with joint work with Daron Hashimodu at MIT. And what's it about? Well, I was ordered to talk about liberty is in the title. We could talk about liberty if you like, but I thought I'd focus on something more concrete, perhaps, which is economic development. And I'll try to talk about where economic development comes from and why there's such divergent development in the world. And I'll just talk about the theory, and perhaps in the discussion we can get into some of these topics that everyone's obviously kind of very interested in, as came up in the discussion with Dr. Fukuyama. So it's called Balance of Power, and you'll see by the end of 20 minutes why it's called Balance of Power. Okay, so the economic development that's been understood by economists for a long time. What is it that creates successful economic development? It's innovation, it's accumulation, it's saving, where does that come from? It comes from having broad-based economic incentives and opportunities in society. So what we called in Why Nations Fail, we called that inclusive economic institutions. So inclusive economic institutions stimulates innovation, it stimulates social mobility. That's what creates economic development. Economists have known that for a long time. The question is, why on earth is there such variation in the world in the type of economic institutions? Why is it that some places manage to create inclusive economic institutions and others failed miserably to create inclusive economic institutions? And our view is that's a political problem. Economic institutions are a collective choice. They're chosen through a political system. So if you want to have inclusive economic institutions, you don't get that by hiring better economic advisors. You get it by having an inclusive political process. Okay? And we emphasize two dimensions of what this inclusive political process should look like. One is a capable state. So having a state with capacity to raise resources, regulate society, enforce rules. Okay? The other thing is a broad distribution of political power. So you don't get inclusive economic institutions at the whim of some dictatorship. You get it because people have power to demand it and make it happen. Okay? So today really I'm going to talk about, and the new book is really about, so how is it that some countries ended up with inclusive political institutions and other countries didn't? Okay? And the key to thinking about that is what I call the difficult combination. And the difficult combination is how to combine these two things. How to combine a state with capacity and a broad distribution of political power in society. Why is that difficult to combine? It's difficult to combine because if you have a state which is capable but political power is narrowly concentrated, then the people in control of the state can use the state to make sure that political power doesn't spread, doesn't broaden. And if on the other hand you have a society where there is broad distribution of political power but there isn't a capable, effective state, then it turns out to be very difficult to build it. It turns out to be difficult to build a state in that context. And I'll give you a very concrete example of that. So now let me get very historical, if you'll bear with me. And I'm going to raise the question of, okay, so we're talking about Europe, we're talking about the United States, North America. We kind of have this idea that some parts of the world are prosperous. They have these kind of inclusive economic institutions. They probably have this combination of broad distribution of power and effective states. So how is it that, let me ask a historical question, which is how is it that some parts of the world ended up with these inclusive political institutions? Okay? So how did Europe, for example, end up with inclusive political institutions? Okay, that's a deeply historical question. It didn't happen 50 years ago. It didn't happen 100 years ago. In fact, in some sense, in the book, we argue, maybe it happened 1,500 years ago. Okay, what happened 1,500 years ago? That sounds wildly historical. Well, 1,500 years ago, the Western Roman Empire collapsed, but it left a legacy of state institutions, bureaucratic institutions, fiscal institutions. There was the church, there was writing, there was even lawyers. And what the Western Roman Empire did was it merged with very accountable democratic society in the form of the Germanic tribes. Okay, so here's a quote, our best description of what the Germanic tribes look like. comes from the Roman historian Tacitus. Here's a description. There's too many words here, but the Germanic tribes had a political system which was incredibly participatory. Okay, so Tacitus is talking about debate. He's talking about the assembly. He's talking about the assemblies elect rulers and officials, and they're very involved in administering justice. So these Franks, the Goths, the Visigoths, the Lombards, the Burgundians, all those names that are very famous from the geography of Western Europe, these Germanic tribes were based on this extremely participatory political system. Okay? They merged with the state institutions of the late Roman Empire. Here's King Clovis is being baptized. That's a kind of interesting moment of co-opting church institutions. Here's a description of Frankish political institutions. At the time, it's the earliest kind of accurate description, sort of detailed description we have. It's by a gentleman called Hincmar, and he's talking about the same thing. There are these assemblies. There are two assemblies. There's a big assembly, lots of people. There's all this participation. The Frankish state took on these two elements. It merged this upward, very kind of participatory aspect with this state institutions. Okay, so to start thinking about where did this come from, if you start thinking about Europe and you start thinking about parliaments, there's all these parliaments everywhere, there's all these assemblies, there's all this, where did all that come from? This is where it all came from. Okay, so this is a long time ago. What did King Clovis do? He kind of promulgated a legal code called the Salic Law. What I want to point out about this, something very interesting, this is a preface to one surviving version. 4 men chosen out of many stood out. Their names were Wisogast, Arrogast, Saligast, and Widogast. It sounds like the Lord of the Rings or something, right? But they came from beyond the Rhine, where the Franks came from, and they came together with 3 legal assemblies discussing the cases, very participatory legal system. So the laws was a kind of bottom-up construction coming out of society, codifying customs, regulations, etc. Not some grand top-down state-driven project, a very bottom-up project. And that is, that's the history of a large part of the world where we find these inclusive institutions. Snippets of British history, it's the birthplace of modern democracy. That's a little bit of an overstatement, but this is Runnymede. This is Runnymede Meadow, where they signed the Magna Carta in 1215. So what's Runnymede Meadow? It's like outside London, by the River Thames. Like, why did they do it there? They could have done it anywhere. Well, not exactly, because it turns out that Runnymede was exactly a place where the Anglo-Saxon version of the assembly, called a witan, that's where witans used to meet. So it's actually a very symbolic place for King John and the barons to get together and sign this great charter. Okay, so I can't go into this in huge detail. I'm going to try to get to some of the implications of this, but here I'm just pointing out, okay, where did all this come from? It's a very participatory process. There's society. It's not a bunch of people sitting around in Philadelphia coming up with some clever institutional architecture of checks and balances. It's a very participatory process from the get-go, very deeply historical. Okay? I could go right the way through. I'm not going to talk about it too much, but let me just say one kind of snapshot. So one kind of little snapshot in this long history, thinking about the British case. Here's the construction of the modern fiscal state in the 18th century, according to the historian John Brewer. This is Supervisor Cowperthwaite, good name, good British name, Saxon name. Supervisor Cowperthwaite's revenue round. Supervisor Cowperthwaite went around looking at people, what they were doing, what they were producing, monitoring the bread and the beer and all that sort of stuff, so he could tax it. Okay, this is really the first time the British state officials, professional people, penetrated into every nook and cranny of England. Okay, what happened when this occurred? Charles Tilly wrote about this, the great sociologist. There was an enormous reaction in society. Okay, the state spreading created this huge reaction from society. In fact, it created a much more national society, much less interested in parochial issues, organizing on a bigger scale, complaining about bigger things to bigger people like members of parliament. Okay, so the image I want to get across here, just in this little snippet, is yes, there's a fusion of these two things, but there's a lot of competition and contestation between state and state's elites and society. The Magna Carta was a conflict. It led to more conflict. The history of democratization and the deepening of democratization is a conflict. Building state institutions is a conflict because a fiscal system suddenly was very threatening to people and they tried to organize to control it. So this is not a consensual process. It's a very conflictual and messy process, but that's what creates inclusive political institutions. It's a competition almost between the state and the society. The initial conditions came about in this particular way I was describing, and then you get this dynamic, which in a minute I'm going to call the Red Queen effect, this competition between state and society. Okay, in a minute, actually, in more like a second. Okay, so that's in the book, we call that, what sort of state emerges out of this process, okay? We call in the book a shackled Leviathan, okay? Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes, famous book about the state. A shackled Leviathan, okay? That's a state with capacity that's accountable where power is broadly spread in society, what I called inclusive political institutions. But obviously, that's hard to create because we know that most countries in the world most parts of the world don't have such states. So what are the other options? And why is it so difficult to create? Okay. Well, let me think about China. Everyone's obsessed and fixated on Chinese development. So what about China? Why didn't that happen to China? Well, if you go back deep enough in Chinese history, China doesn't look so different from Europe. Here's a page from a famous philosophical treatise, and I just kind of annotate what the Chinese characters say here. King, boat, common people, water, water, holds up boat, water, sinks boat. Okay? That's a statement about accountability. The king is in the boat, the common people are the water can hold up the boat, or the water can sink the boat. Okay? So there's some notion of accountability that rulers have to be accountable to people if you go back deep enough, 2,500 years into Chinese history. But this fusion that emerged with the Franks never emerges in China. In fact, after this, a new model emerged, and here's one of the kind of intellectual founders of that model. He's called Shang or Lord Shang, and here's a statement from his, a fragment of his surviving writings. When the people are weak, the state is strong. Hence, the state that possesses the way, I guess that's the topic for your conference next year, right? The way. You can invite Michael Pruitt. He's very good on that. The state that possesses the way strives to weaken the people. Okay, so it's going to be it's a theorem in our book that Lord Shang was wrong, as hopefully I'll convince you by the end of my talk today. But I want to emphasize here, when the people are weak, the state is strong. That's what he had wrong. Okay, so he had a very different model from the model of the Franks and the Salic Law and this kind of participatory society. He had a very top-down autocratic model of dominance, and that's been the path of China over the past 2,300, 2,400 years. Okay, so you all know about this nowadays. Here's the China's social credit system. It's a kind of work in progress, but they're monitoring and evaluating and correcting everybody. George Orwell is rolling in his grave. And and if you've been in China recently, they're setting up this enormous kind of forest of these cameras everywhere, trying to monitor and control people. So it's a model with deep roots in Chinese history. It's reproduced itself without any kind of history of participation or accountability that you see, with the Franks or you see all over Western Europe. Okay, so once you start thinking about the Chinese case, what we call a despotic Leviathan, you kind of start thinking about gosh, you know, might you not be worried about creating such a thing? So I said, you know, I talked about the difficult combination. The difficult combination is like, here I talked about one part of it. You know, in the Chinese case, you have the Chinese state. The problem in China is not instability. The problem in China is stability. It's been stable for 2,300 years, and there's every likelihood that it will carry on being stable. Okay? So, but the anticipation that you might end up in such a despotic society seems to us to be an enormous disincentive to actually build state capacity in a society where you don't have it, but you're very anxious about trying to control it. Okay? Let me give you an example of that from African anthropology. There's too much. I'll just tell you the story. Okay? It's from a famous piece of research by Paul Bohannon amongst the Tiv people of eastern Nigeria. And the Tiv were a stateless society. They had no state, they had no lawyers, they had no police. They had chiefs, but the chiefs didn't really do anything. They just kind of mediated disputes. Why didn't they have a state? You know, economists, we love states. We think they provide public goods and order, and we need them for development. Why didn't the Tiv have a state? Okay. Well, Bohannon tells the story in the following way. In 1939, there was a gentleman who was selling fetishes and protection from witches. You know, in fact, here's one of Bohannon's photographs of a Tiv diviner. And if you gave him some money, he gave you a fly whisk. Okay. What did you do with this fly whisk? Well, you searched out fake salve is the word. Okay, so the idea of salve is like power. It means power. Okay, so and particularly power over people, charismatic power. You know, so some people are just very charismatic. You know, when I used to teach at Harvard, I used to give the example of Larry Summers. You know, Larry Summers, just a very charismatic guy, comes into the room, everyone pays attention. He's just, you know, very clever, very charismatic. But the thing about salve is, some people have it naturally, but you can also acquire it through cannibalism. Okay? So there's two ways of having a lot of salve. What's the consequence of that? People with salve are never really trusted, you know? They could be like that, but you never quite know. All right? So what Bohannon points out is that, so now salve means power. The plural, mbatsav. It has two meanings in Tiv society. Powerful people, the plural, and a group of witches organized for nefarious purposes. So what Bohannon points out is this is kind of like the word politician having two meanings. You know, politicians could be people who run and contest public office, or a group of witches organized for nefarious purposes. You know, maybe some of you recognize your countries. But I'm English, so of course that, you know, that's not clearly not relevant. So what's going on here? Men who acquired too much power were whittled down by means of witchcraft accusations. You searched out the fake salve with your fly whisk, and then you accused the person of being a witch. Okay, Nyambua, that was the name of the cult, was one of a regular series of movements to which Tiv political action, with its distrust of power, okay, that's the key, distrust of power, gives rise to so that the greater political institutions based on the lineage and egalitarianism can persist. So this is anxiety about hierarchy and centralization and not being able to control it, okay? That's a very prevalent mechanism in world history. And think of it like this. On the one hand, you have China. You know, there's a sort of state dominates society. You could say amongst the Tiv, there is no state, really. You know, society dominates the state. That looks like a weird ethnographic example, but think of Lebanon. You know, in Lebanon, society dominates the state too. Okay, why is that? Same reason as amongst the Tiv. You don't want to concede authority to something you can't control. Okay, so the state dominates society, society dominates the state. In the middle is the thing I started describing, you know, with the Franks. There's a balance of power, or as we have in the title, we call this a narrow corridor. Okay, so there's a sort of trichotomy here between this despotic Leviathan, this absent Leviathan, It's a bit clunky, the terminology, but we're stuck with it now, so I better get used to it. And the shackled Leviathan. Okay, so this theory is meant to sort of emphasize there's enormous persistence, there's diversity in the world, but the diversity is very persistent. Okay, it's very hard to create centralized institutions, historically in Nigeria and the Congo, and it's very hard to create centralized institutions today in Nigeria and the Congo, and it has a lot to do with the same sorts of reasons that it had to do with concentrating power in TIV society. There's also, enormous persistence in these other outcomes, such as this despotic Leviathan, as I was kind of emphasizing. So if you were going to say, okay, so what's the implications of this theory? Let me draw out a few implications and talk about why is this interesting from a kind of practical point of view as opposed to a kind of intellectual point of view. Well, the first thing to say is, in this model, real inclusive political institutions and real state capacity emerges from this contest between state and society. It's not some engineering problem, to create effective state institutions. You need to compete with society, because that's it's this tussle, like the tussle I was describing in 18th century England between the construction of the fiscal system and the excise tax system and the mobilization of society. It's that pushes society to organize, the society pushes the state to organize. In our theory, if the state kind of creates this hegemonic control over society in China, then there's no contest, and you don't get that Red Queen dynamics working, and you end up with a state which has less capacity. Okay? So the first implication, as I said, is, it's a theorem in the model. Lord Shang was wrong. Okay? So the Chinese model, whatever that is inherently limited, because the state is created without this cooperation and contestation with society, and that's a crucial implication. Another thing I sort of flagged out of this is that there's no natural process of diversity is the norm in the world. Institutional diversity, diversity in the relationships between state and society. It's kind of deeply rooted historically, and you don't expect that to automatically change. I wouldn't expect it to automatically change in China, and I wouldn't expect it to automatically change anywhere else. Okay? So another thing I emphasized here, if you start looking at this process, this historical process that create these particular institutions, is that it's not about clever institutional design. If you even think about the US case, okay, the Constitution, there's enormous amounts of contestation over that. Think of the Bill of Rights. Where did the Bill of Rights come from? The Bill of Rights came from social reaction against the constitutional design. Where are the rights? What happened to the rights? James Madison had to agree to kind of support the Bill of Rights to even get himself elected from Virginia. So if you go back and look at that, there's enormous contestation. Probably the Constitution would never have got written if it hadn't been for Shays' rebellion in Massachusetts. So there was a lot of contestation. It wasn't just a bunch of clever people sitting down and coming up with some architecture. Okay, society was very mobilized because of the War of Independence, and that's a crucial part of the story. Okay, and here's an implication for those of you who think about policy, which is that if you like that picture I showed you, one thing it sort of drives home is, well, if you think of the problem of development as somehow getting into this corridor and getting this Red Queen effect working, the problem you face is very different in different parts of the world. There's no one-size-fits-all solution here, right? Depending on where you are in this parameter space, the problem is very different, okay? If you're down here, you need to go up. If you're over here, you need to go across. That's not very likely as politics, as I say, because you'd expect in a despotic state to stay over here, okay? But this can happen. One thing, for example, I was, in the discussion of rights that some gentleman brought up, or somebody brought up, I couldn't quite see who that was. I'm talking about a very historical thing, but the shape of this corridor is very different now than it was, in 1,500 years ago when King Clovis was getting himself crowned in France. So the shape of the corridor depends on all sorts of things, on globalization, it depends on ideas and many other things, okay? So that's important to understand. And, if you're down here, there's different paths. So depending on where you are, there's going to be a different problem to solve, and there's going to be a different path into the corridor. And, here's one of my favorite paths, which is, imagine you're down here in Bogota, in Colombia, in the early 1990s. You have a weak state, you have a kind of chaotic under-provision of public goods, power cuts, all sorts of problems with security, violence. You have a pretty weak society in the sense of disorganized, parochial, very clientelistic, focused on private benefits, not public goods. How do you get into the corridor from here? Well, you could try this arrow. You could try building society and state at the same time. And in some sense, that's exactly what, Antanas Mokas did. Here he is as super citizen. You may have seen this photograph. When he became mayor of Bogota, it was a particular historical juncture where not just him, but also Jaime Castro, who was the previous mayor, were able to exploit this process of rewriting the constitution and the kind of democratization in Colombian society. It created an opportunity for this to happen. But his strategy was very much strengthen society, mobilize society to push the state and get the state to work, but very much the interplay between the state and the society. So Liliana Caballero, who was his chief of staff, here's a quote I like a lot, not to have the citizens go around asking for favors, but asking for their rights. Don't have the citizens circling around the state. Have the state circling around the citizens. So it was interplay, between reforming state institutions, but getting society to push at the same time. Okay, so that's a kind of image that I want to get into your heads, and it's that interaction that generates these inclusive political institutions that creates this productive combination, solves this problem of what I call the difficult combination. All right, and I'll shut up.